move on. So I'd actually like to introduce our host for today, which is Dr. Shirley Harper. So Dr. Harper is a Canada Research Chair in Climate Change and Health, as well as the Vice Chair of Working Group 1 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. So Dr. Harper, the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to start by introducing Ramon. Ramon is the IPCC Vice Chair, so if you can just give a little hi, wave, hello to everyone. Ramon leads the Indigenous partnerships and relations within the IPCC. So we're really lucky to have him joining us here today. So thanks for joining us, Ramon, and welcome. Next, I'm really delighted to welcome the partners for this session, the Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Assembly of First Nations. Both the Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Assembly of First Nations are official IPCC observer organizations. So they're co-hosting this session with us at IPCC here today. So first, I'd like to invite both of these organizations to offer a few words of welcome and maybe comment on their observer role within the IPCC. So Kata, on behalf of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, over to you first.
Good day, everybody, and thank you very much, Sherry, for starting off our session. Very grateful to everybody who's joined today and looking forward to seeing some substantial participation of Indigenous peoples, reflection of Indigenous knowledges within the 7th assessment cycle. My name is Kata Kunert. I'm the Climate Change Policy Advisor at the Inuit Circumpolar Council International, based out of the Canada office. I'm calling in today from the Western Arctic region of Canada in Inuvik, Northwest Territories. That's Inuvialuit and Gwich'in lands governed under the Inuvialuit Final Agreement and the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement. I myself am non-Indigenous. I have the pleasure and the privilege to help to facilitate Inuit participation in climate-related multilateral fora, including the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The Inuit Circumpolar Council is a major international Indigenous peoples organization representing over 180,000 Inuit living in the United Inuit traditional homelands called Inuit Nunnat, but bisected by colonial borders to be a part of what we would now call Russia, Canada, the United States of America, and Kashlali Nunnat or Greenland. ICC serves to strengthen the unity among Inuit, to promote Inuit rights and interests at the international level, encourage long-term policies that safeguard the Arctic, and to seek the full and active participation of Inuit in all elements of circumpolar governance, and additionally within all climate-related governance in regional, national, international, multilateral fora. Inuit have served as substantive authors within the IPCC processes, although we galvanize support for Inuit to take more leadership roles within the IPCC process. The Inuit Circumpolar Council is the first, and until the last IPCC meeting, has been the only Indigenous peoples organization with status at the IPCC. And we very much welcome we would very much support the participation and the representation of other Indigenous peoples organizations within this forum. It is a relatively simple process for those accredited to the UNFCCC process to also gain status as observer organizations within the IPCC. Some of our primary objectives within the IPCC are for Inuit and Inuit knowledge, as well as for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge more broadly, to be ethically and equitably reflected throughout the work and reports of the IPCC, to see a long-term accountability body within the IPCC, such as an Indigenous Peoples Task Force or advisory body, to have the IPCC recognize and respect the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples as outlined in the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous, and to have greater recognition for the Arctic region as a very sensitive and important area of planetary change at present. So thank you very much to the IPCC Bureau for hosting this information session. And I'll pass the mic over to my colleague, Graham Reed.
Yeah, so miigwech kata and anim bojo, Gurmreed and Ichnikas, Ottawa, Nojaba, Anishinaabe, and Dao. I'm very honored to join all of you from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe Aki, what's currently known as Ottawa, and have the distinct pleasure of sharing a little bit of perspective and experiences from the Assembly of First Nations. But I do want to extend my appreciation for the IPCC in organizing this and committing to a better engagement with Indigenous peoples within the IPCC. And we look forward to seeing the implications of that within the reports themselves. And so appreciative of the space, but also of all the participants attending. So I should say my dad's side is English and Scottish, and mom's is German and Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes. Specifically, my great grandfather's from Okonkong, and have had the pleasure of being at the Assembly of First Nations for about 9 years now. And the Assembly of First Nations, the AFN, for those who don't know what we are a national political advocacy body for First Nations across Canada. There are over 634 First Nations across the country and just under 1 million First Nations within what we currently call as Canada. The AFN works on the basis of mandates provided by the First Nations in Assembly, and we've had multiple mandates related to the declaration of a First Nations climate emergency, which led the foundation to the creation of the AFN National Climate Strategy, which really stemmed from a call from First Nations across the country to declare a state of emergency for our lands, waters, people, plants, and all other beings. And really, that is the foundation of our advocacy within the IPCC and within other international fora. Is how are we advocating for the ethical and equitable engagement of First Nations knowledge systems or Indigenous knowledge systems? How do we create space for direct First Nations participations and voice, upholding the jurisdiction and authority? How do we ensure rights-based engagement with Indigenous peoples, acknowledging the individual and collective rights, including those reaffirmed within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? And how do we make sure that organizations like the IPCC create space for diverse ways of knowing and being? And so really the opportunity here is to continue creating that space for Indigenous peoples. As Kata mentioned, the application process is relatively straightforward. The intention today is really to talk about procedurally what are the ways in which that you can get involved. There are lots of opportunities to do so. There are also lots of opportunities outside of the IPCC, and how do we build that momentum of Indigenous solidarity internationally? And ultimately, how do we ensure institutions like the IPCC can serve our people and planet and support the advancement of just, equitable, decolonial, and relational futures for all beings. And so really excited to hear from our panelists today. And I'll turn it back to you, Sherry. Miigwech.
Thank you both so much for those comments. I really appreciate hearing about your calls for IPCC to improve and grow and do a better job in terms of indeed engaging with Indigenous people and knowledge systems. I also appreciated hearing calls for more Indigenous observer organizations to join the IPCC. It would be great to have more Indigenous organizations join to, create some sort of Indigenous task group or Indigenous caucus or something like that within the IPCC. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen. What I would like to do next is provide a little bit of an introduction to the current IPCC 7th assessment cycle. So I'll share my screen now. I'm assuming you can see my slides okay? Yep, first slide share. Okay, perfect. So I'm calling in from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is on Treaty 6 territory, Métis region number 4 in Alberta. And I'm calling in from my home, which is on Papastu lands. I'm really, really grateful to be able to be here today to talk to you a little bit about the IPCC 7th assessment cycle. So the IPCC is a UN organization that sits under the United Nations Environmental Program and the World Meteorological Organization. And the IPCC's rule is, like, the mandate is really to assess the science on climate change. The goal is to make scientific assessments that aren't policy prescriptive but are policy relevant. There's been 6 assessment cycles so far, dating all the way back to 1988. And each assessment cycle has had really important influences especially through the UNFCCC. So, for example, the 5th assessment report really provided important background information and scientific assessment that informed the Paris Agreement in 2015. So we've finished 6 assessment cycles, and now we're in the 7th assessment cycle. Each assessment cycle, to produce a report, there's a number of different steps that we have to go through, all the way, starting at number 1, where we're scoping the outline of the reports with different stakeholders from around the world, all the way to step number 10, where the reports are published. The one thing that makes IPCC reports a little bit unique than other UN climate change reports is that it goes through an approval process with IPCC member countries. So there's 195 different member states that are involved, and they review the summary for policymakers. They go over it line by line through an approval process. And once the summary for policymakers has been approved by governments, that implies the approval and acceptance of the entire report. So right now we're at step number 3. We've had this scoping meeting where experts from around the world have come together to create draft outlines. We took that to governments for feedback, edits, and revisions, and it was agreed to by the governments. And now we're going through the process of author nominations, which is one of the reasons that we're here today. So there's lots of different other outputs that are part of the 7th assessment cycle that are listed on the screen here. Today, we're really focusing in on the 7th assessment report for Working Group 1, Working Group 2, and Working Group 3. But there are other reports that are part of this cycle. And I also wanted to highlight other activities that I think are really important for IPCC in terms of our journey to try and improve Indigenous engagement and Indigenous inclusion within the IPCC. That includes an expert workshop on Indigenous knowledge systems and an expert meeting on gender and inclusivity. Both of these, the workshop and the expert meeting, we're not sure when they're going to be at. They haven't been scheduled, but we're hoping sometime in October. So there will be 3 different reports that are produced: Working Group 1 report, Working Group 2, and Working Group 3. So Working Group 1 is really focusing on the physical science basis. So that is assessing how the climate has changed and how it could change into the future. Working Group 2 is looking at how those climate changes that have already happened or that are projected to happen, what impacts they have on society and the environment, as well as different adaptation strategies to try and reduce some of those risks and create resilience. And Working Group 3 is focused on mitigation of climate change, so how we can stop the climate from changing any further. So each of these working group reports have an outline that was approved by governments. I'm not going to go through the outlines in detail here, but we are going to put a link in the chat to the different outlines for each of the working groups. So if you're interested in knowing what the chapters are for Working Group 1, Working Group 2, and Working Group 3, just click on that link in the chat and it will take you to where you need to go to find those details. But what I think is really important to highlight is that in each one of these reports for Working Group 1, Working Group 2, and Working Group 3, and I would argue that within every single chapter within these reports, it's important that we do a better job of including Indigenous content and Indigenous knowledge systems in all of the AR7 products. So there's different ways to get involved, and we're going to be going through some of these in a little bit more detail, hearing from panelists shortly. The first way is to contribute to the existing literature base, and this includes both peer-reviewed literature and gray literature. So that sort of creates the literature base that the IPCC is responsible for assessing. You could also serve as an expert reviewer. So the IPCC draft reports are open for review from anyone around the world who has expertise or knowledge on climate change. You can provide expert reviewer comments on the draft versions of the report. In the sixth assessment cycle, I was a lead author on two different reports, and I have to say that the expert review comments really do shape the reports. So if you're you're wondering whether these review comments make a difference or not, I can tell you for sure that in AR6, they really did contribute to improving the reports. And then the last way, which we'll talk a little bit more about today, is as an author, a lead author, a coordinating lead author, a review editor, or a contributing author. So there's different ways you can be an author on these reports. So with there, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll move on to the next part of our agenda. Okay, so now we're going to hear some more presentations. We do want to hear your questions and comments, but please hold on to your questions and comments until the end of the session. So, you can either note your comments down on a piece of paper in front of you, or you can pop them right into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We really do want to hear from you, and we will circle back to going over all of those Q&As with all of the people, the presenters, and all the panelists that you're going to hear from today. So we'll have a Q&A period at the end of the session. So for the rest of the session, we've sort of broken it down into two different parts. First, we want to look back on the AR6 process within the IPCC. So we're going to first look back and look for areas of progress, but also gaps and limitations from the last IPCC assessment cycle. Then we're going to look forward to AR7 and explore opportunities and envision how we might be able to more meaningfully and ethically advance Indigenous inclusion in the reports. So we're going to start by looking back. And to do this, it's my pleasure to first introduce Dr. Rosario Carmona. Rosa led the analysis of Indigenous inclusion in the IPCC AR6 assessment, and she's going to share some of her results today and insights from this analysis. So Rosa, perfect. I'm really delighted to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Thank you so much for this invitation. I would also like to acknowledge the land I am based today, the Wallmapu, the territory protected by the Mapuche people in what now is known as the south of Chile. I'm going to share my screen now and give me 1 second. Please let me know if my slides don't change because sometimes that happens. What I want to present today is the analysis that Graham, our co-authors, and I conducted on the inclusion and consideration of Indigenous peoples' knowledges and participation in the last IPCC cycle. Our analysis focused on mentions of the term Indigenous that clearly refer to Indigenous peoples. These references have grown considerably, as we can see. However, this increase is not consistent across the different working groups or even across the chapters within the same reports. Specifically, in Working Group 1, which focuses on the physical science of climate change, the references to Indigenous peoples remain very limited. Still, compared to previous reports, there is a noticeable increase. The main message here is the recognition that Indigenous knowledges can complement non-Indigenous science, but integration remains a challenge. And I want to notice that integration is the word that the IPCC uses. However, this framing tends to position Indigenous knowledges as subordinate, mainly as a supporting or validating resource for Western or non-Indigenous science, rather than as a knowledge system of right holders. This reflects a fairly apolitical approach to inequality and vulnerability, treating this as naturalized conditions. And here I want to share a personal experience as a contributing author to this working group. I was very disappointed to see a statement in chapter 1 claiming that indigenous knowledges are being lost primarily because knowledge holders are passing away, which reduces the problem to a kind of demographic issue without addressing the systemic causes of knowledge erosion, such as colonialism and marginalization, and even climate change. In contrast, Working Group 2, which addresses impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, includes over 1,000 references to indigenous peoples. It strongly emphasized the relevance of indigenous knowledges in responding to climate change and calls for the integration of indigenous and scientific knowledge systems. It also highlights the importance of indigenous peoples' participation in climate governance, recognizing their knowledge's contribution to resilience, risk reduction, adaptation, climate justice, policymaking, and sustainable food and water systems. It also recognized not only the impacts of climate change, but the impacts of caused by maladaptation and what we can say false solutions. And very crucially, acknowledges colonialism for the first time as a driver of vulnerability. Working Group 3, which focuses on mitigation, contains a more moderate number of references. It emphasized the role of indigenous peoples in sustainable land management and their contribution to mitigation. It also notes the need for participatory strategies and recognizes the transformative potential of indigenous knowledges. And I want to highlight this because Working Group 3 has often been associated with promoting market-based solutions that sometimes perpetuate the same structural problems, such as carbon markets. So this shift towards transformative change is brief, but I think a very notable inclusion. And finally, the synthesis report includes 24 references to indigenous peoples. This reinforced the findings of Working Group 2 regarding colonialism, maladaptation, and participation. Despite this progress, we believe significant limitations remain. There is still a lack of ethical, rights-based, or deeply engaged approaches to indigenous knowledges. Representation of indigenous peoples is inconsistent across the working groups, reflecting a lack of consensus within the IPCC itself on how to meaningfully engage indigenous peoples and their knowledges. There is also a tendency to homogenize indigenous peoples, treating them as a single, undifferentiated group without acknowledging specific nations, territories, cultures, or values. And there is very little attention to intersectionality among indigenous peoples themselves. Furthermore, while colonialism is acknowledged, indigenous peoples continue to be framed primarily as vulnerable, rather than as agents of change. Their knowledges are often simplified or misunderstood and not treated as complex living systems. They are often conflated with local knowledge or overlooking the deep relationship between indigenous peoples, their territories, and their inherent rights. The reports also fail to explain how indigenous knowledge holders were involved in the process, and there is no discussion of co-production of knowledge between indigenous contribution and lead authors. And we know that there was a working group created to promote better engagement, but there is no information on the reports about this process. And we believe this is largely due to the lack of indigenous authors, particularly coordinating lead authors, but also the limited influence of contributing authors who often have very little opportunity to engage in meaningful dialogue or propose changes within the drafting process. Although the benefits of collaboration are mentioned, very few concrete examples are provided. The reports offer little evidence of partnerships between indigenous knowledge holders and non-indigenous scientists. They also fail to reflect the growing body of indigenous-led research and initiatives. All of this evidences the structural limitations of the IPCC as a body that primarily reviews scientific literature and doesn't engage with knowledge holders or other means of assessment. From this analysis, we propose a series of recommendations aimed at strengthening the participation and leadership of indigenous peoples in the AR7 cycle, and ideally starting from the scoping process. And the question I would like to finish is, could the creation of a task force on indigenous knowledge system or other body like the one established under IPBES help advance a evidence-based approach to engagement. I know this is a broader topic that deserves its own space for conversation, but I believe that the key point to consider is that any body created for this purpose must have a binding approach or a binding mandate. It should also facilitate direct engagement with CLAs and LAs and not be structured as a parallel space reserved only for Indigenous peoples whose outputs are considered merely as recommendations. This question is not only important for understanding how Indigenous peoples can influence the IPCC, but also for improving how the information presented in AR7 can be accessible and truly helpful and meaningful for Indigenous peoples themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing those findings from your really important analysis of IPCC AR6, Dr. Carmona. So let's continue this AR6 discussion with Dr. Ritoti Chakraborty, who is a lecturer in the Department of Environmental Management at Lincoln University and a co-founder of the Knowledge Justice Collective. Ritoti also analyzed IPCC AR6 products for Indigenous inclusion, including an analysis of the literature that was cited in Working Group 1, 2, and 3. Ritoti, over to you to continue our reflection on the 6th assessment cycle.
Let me share my screen. That's all right. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Yes. First off, thank you so much, Shirley, for this opportunity and to engage with the IPCC process. First off, I'd like to acknowledge as well that while my ancestors from the Bengal Delta, I'm currently on territories and lands of Naitua Hiriri and Itamutu and Naitahu in Te Waiponamu, which is the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So my gratitude and respect to all.
Ritoti, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We can see it in presenter view. Just so you know, if you want to, you can feel free to keep it in that mode if you want. I just wanted to let you know that I think we see what you see.
Is that better?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. So going on with that, so I think Dr. Carmona set it up perfectly for what I would want to address today. Here's a small outline of what you hear from me. We'll build on some of the aspirations of analysis that we did on the R6, the last cycle. And from my end, we'll do a bit more of strategic interventions that could be done as Indigenous inclusion, right? Because one of the things that I look at and I investigate, but also work on, is the creation of material products. So how do we go beyond the conversations? How do we go beyond the dialogue to actually intervene in meaningful ways to ensure that there is Indigenous participation within the broader process of the IPCC? So these are just some insights from our analysis of the AR6 to help you understand where we are coming from. We looked at, many of the citations. I mean, there's over 100,000 citations in the AR6, but we looked at the ones that were publicly available. And out of that, there's 0.01% of all citations engage with Indigenous knowledge. And of that 0.01%, less than 70% were co-produced with communities. So what that means is that, while we have come a long way, there's just physically a lack of Indigenous knowledge within the overall IPCC. However, on the positive side, a third of all those citations are in just 3 chapters, which I'll refer to again as we go along in terms of what are some of the strategic spaces for intervention, right? And how it really matters who is driving the agenda of individual chapters. Another thing that we see is a lot of indigenous knowledge that is present is represented, is from the global north, right? So even when we have indigenous scholars or communities presented, they tend to be stacked more towards the global north. And then finally, we see a massive disciplinary bias with environmental science and climate science as the two most prominent disciplines, even within the indigenous knowledge, right? So we're not here referring to the overall report. We are only referring to the citations, the knowledge that was put into the report that actively dealt with indigenous knowledge. Even within that setting, it is environmental science and climate science, those two disciplines that are driving. So what we can, conclude in some ways is that there's an enduring power imbalance between mainstream science and indigenous and local knowledge. Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge inclusion is geographically biased and it's scholarly biased as well, right? And there's a real lack of funding in indigenous knowledge and local knowledge as standalone research projects that don't play complementary or supplementary role to mainstream science, right? So these are some of the key issues that we would like to address in the next cycle. So what are some strategic interventions that we can think about, right? So on one hand, we have capacity building, legacy support, and accountability. And then on the other hand, we can think of the spaces for that intervention, right? So you can think about the green intersecting circles as the ways in which the support and the enabling can be done, right? And the orange circles or the yellow circles are the places where we can have those interventions. So moving on, first to data justice, right? I think one of the key issues that has emerged in conversations with a lot of indigenous communities as well is that how do you ensure security of knowledge that is actually given to the IPCC, right? If we don't have systems in place to ensure that that data is treated fairly, then it becomes a problem because a lot of this data is not held as data, right? These are very deep traditional ancestral relationships. The other 2 points, right, immutability and traceability are equally important. Immutability brings up a really important conundrum that we have, right? And you'll see this often in other forms of environmental governance or projects where indigenous knowledge is engaged with. So as an example, what you'll see is, let's say someone is interviewing an elder or someone's doing an oral history. Ultimately, that piece of knowledge is then transformed into some kind of a quantitative value to be put inside either some sort of a decision-making matrix or a statistical program, which I think is fundamentally an issue because the data has to remain in many ways honest to what produced it, right? So within a community space, we have to be very careful about the immutability aspect of that data. And then finally, traceability is absolutely vital. Understanding what happened to the stories, to the lessons that were passed on, to these really nuanced understandings of climate society relationships, which have been given to scientists or to the IPCC. What happens with that? And can the community at various parts of that process actually step in and ask for a bit of a, hey, what's going on, right? So the second thing is analytics, and this is often the hardest one. I would say, again, think of these ideas that I'm presenting as the spaces for intervention. These are the places where I feel indigenous practitioners as well as scholars have a massive role to play. The first one, detection and attribution algorithms. I was directly involved with questioning some of the ways in which these algorithms were being deployed in the last cycle, right? And I would really urge other folks out there that are interested in building justice-based algorithms to step up to the plate and help the IPCC chapters as well as process to create better detection and attribution algorithms. Because currently the way in which the causal pathways are linked of X going to Y doesn't always work out. Because the reason why you're seeing famine somewhere, or the reason why you're seeing a flooding somewhere, often has a lot to do with things like colonial land management or unequal markets, which sort of get all squashed into the climate variable, right? So it's very important that Indigenous scholars step up into this analytical space. The second thing, the second and the third thing, confronting false integration and parallel outputs. I saw that someone had asked this question around integration, and I would love to say that I absolutely support that view. The way you should think about it is no integration without equity. Because if you have two knowledge systems with very different kinds of power, the more powerful one will ultimately cannibalize or eat the less powerful one. Therefore, integration of knowledge, and I saw that in the chapter that I was a contributing author to, it got in some ways consumed by the mainstream scientific knowledge process that was in that chapter. So we need to be very careful and actually create process that allows us to have these parallel outputs, right, within the same chapter, not tucked away in some other report somewhere, but finding a way to create parallel outputs that don't undermine the sovereignty of each knowledge system. And then finally, I would say in terms of community, meaningful inclusion, I think, starts with things like lead authorship, right? And co-design. This, whether it be at the scoping stage, whether it be at the analytics stage, whether it be at the decisions made around what kinds of data to be even included within the report, there has to be a very clear pathway that allows for interventions at each part of the process. And then finally, I think it's very important to understand that there is limitations of the IPCC as an institution. Therefore, we shouldn't be expecting of it things that it is unable to deliver, right? So there are a lot of options beyond the IPCC, which I think we should also be looking at when it comes to the question of meaningful inclusion. So I'd like to end with this, some suggestions, chapter lead authors, right? Because as we saw in our own analysis, 40% of all Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge citations are in just 4 chapters of AR6. So chapter authors really matter. Second is a certification system reflecting knowledge justice, and that's what we're working on at the moment, where each chapter in some ways gets certified as having Indigenous knowledge that was extractively or non-extractively produced, as well as meaningfully included, right? If you have a chapter level certification system, then that allows people reading that chapter to know the kinds of inclusion or the kinds of politics that is driving that chapter on its own. Finally, the last 2 points is observers and reviewers over numbers of citations. And while I know I'm talking a lot about the citations themselves, I think strategic reclaiming of where you want to intervene, and therefore observers and reviewers, I think in many cases might be even more important than the actual knowledge itself that enters the report. And I can't stress this enough. If there is one place we should be intervening, it is Working Group 1. Working Group 1 has such a lack of Indigenous knowledge that it is completely shocking when you look at the overall report. So please step up, please come forward and help Working Group 1 specifically become a more inclusive space. With that, I'd like to stop my talk and hand it over. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks so much, Rototi. That was amazing. Really, really helpful analysis and also helpful suggestions to move us forward. And that provides a really nice segue actually to the next panel. We know that there's so much to learn from the AR6 report and how we can improve Indigenous participation and what that means in the context of the IPCC. So now we've reflected back or looked back on AR6. So now we want to look forward to AR7, to this next assessment cycle. So next, Dr. Graham Reed and Dr. Pasang Sherpa are going to reflect on some opportunities and challenges as we look ahead and look forward to the 7th assessment cycle within the IPCC. So you have already met Graham earlier in this session. Dr. Graham Reed is a strategic advisor with the Assembly of First Nations, and joining Graham is Dr. Pasang Sherpa. Dr. Pasang Sherpa is an assistant professor of Lifeways in Indigenous Asia at the University of British Columbia. Pasang was a contributing author to the AR6 Working Group 2 report and also on the special report on oceans and cryosphere in a changing climate. She co-founded the Knowledge Justice Collective with Ratoti. So Dr. Sherpa and Dr. Reed, over to you.
Do you want me to start the song? Sure. Yeah. So miigwech to Ratoti for that presentation, and like really, I think substantial recommendations for how we think about our involvement within AR7. And I basically have kind of three buckets of reflections and opportunities. One that really speaks to the last point that was raised about beyond IPCC, not only with respect to like what are the other mechanisms to consider and think about the communication of evidence to address a rapidly changing climate, but also what are the ways in which that we are interrogating the institutional legacies that seem to persist within the body. And part of that is not only with respect to Indigenous peoples. Like I think a lot of the pieces that were raised unearth some of the more structural barriers to non-European, non-male, and non-hard and physical science engagement. And so I think there are these opportunities to consider how do we critically investigate the like mirage of objectivity that exists, which is basically the absence of clear engagement with our own respective positionalities, life experiences, and challenges, which is really the prerequisite to engaging other knowledge systems. Like until we move past the acceptance of dominant systems of science as the ultimate truth, we won't necessarily be able to engage ethically with other systems of knowledge. And so how do we approach that? How do we consider even the siloized nature of the working groups themselves, right? Physical science, adaptation, and then solutions. And there are opportunities between the different working groups to consider those interlinkages, but what are the way in which the body can modify itself over time to better reflect the society that it's responding to, a deeply complex society that is based on these structures of inequitable development, largely driven by colonialism, right? And the persistent legacy of colonialism and the way that we need to approach that within how we address science, how we address the inequity of data and science more broadly. How do we consider moving past the dominance of English, right? Where we're only considering a small fraction of the overall contributions when we operate exclusively in English. And this is coming from an English speaker, right? Like it's amazing how much, prevalence we give to a language that actually reproduces systems of thinking that cause the problem, right? English is a predominantly noun-based language. Many other languages are predominantly verb-based languages. And so what are the ways in which even the body itself is subconsciously upholding these kind of dominant assumptions? I think there was the question in the chat about what the process was for the nomination and selection of authors. And I think for me, what that signals, and Sherry will talk about this in a little bit, but that the IPCC, although it's veiled in some level of scientific objectivity, it is a deeply political space. It's deeply political in the nature of the composition of the governing members, whether that's represented through the Bureau, the selection and identification process, which to Kata's earlier point is why the creation of a body of Indigenous organizations as accredited observers are so important, because the main mechanism to nominate authors is actually through country focal points. And ultimately then the summary for policymakers, which is the main document that a lot of people engage with, is negotiated line by line, right? And so even authors themselves need to contemplate, like, what are the connections between their specific chapter and the summary for policymakers, and how is it a robust representation? And so all of that to say, and I think Ritodi talked a little bit about the citational politics about it as well. But all that to say, so these are the prerequisites to then thinking about how do we engage ethically with Indigenous peoples. And I will preface this by saying, I think we haven't said this explicitly, but when we're talking about the ethical engagement of Indigenous peoples, we're talking about the ethical engagement, or the ethical engagement of Indigenous knowledge. We're talking about the ethical engagement with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous knowledge cannot be separated from the peoples and lands that it originates from. And so even the disconnect between how data is interpreted within a scientific context and how it's represented by Indigenous peoples is an important place that we need to dialogue further on. We talked a little bit about the need for support for authors, right? Both with respect to Indigenous peoples. Currently, the IPCC supports scholars in the global South. Indigenous peoples in the global North would not be a part of that. We know also just the institutional biases associated with who has the time and capacity to contribute. Often Indigenous scholars are quite busy, not only serving their own communities, but serving their responsibilities at the university. And so how to create that space and incentivization for Indigenous peoples, how to think about also empowering non-Indigenous authors, whether contributing lead authors or lead authors, with a robust understanding of what we're actually talking about. And so whether that's through appropriate protocols, whether that's through guidance, whether that's through engaged sessions, like, part of this is really deconstructing the disciplinary biases that we see operating within the UNFCCC more broadly. And then how do we procedurally think about what is required to modify this? And Rosa shared a bit about the mechanism within the IPBES, obviously the task force as a potential mechanism. There's a potential as more Indigenous organizations come in for Indigenous caucus, and how do we exercise our own political voice as Indigenous peoples, but also how do we inform what is the evidence base that is leading to the work and considerations for the IPCC, and how do we avoid the disciplinary nature of it? Like, there is a lot of Indigenous scholarship out there. Maybe it doesn't say climate change on it, but it is directly tied to the work and understanding that climate change within the IPCC is considering. And so how do we expand that? How do we create that spaces for that? And to the point about data justice, how do we ensure the appropriate safeguards for Indigenous peoples to participate and the ethical inclusion of their knowledge systems within the report? I think it's also important to clarify just that, we're talking about often secondary sources from Indigenous peoples, right? Like, because of the approach for peer review and the analysis of the evidence that's required, really we're talking about the interpretation of what knowledge has been received from knowledge holders. And so that's even more important as to what citations are being used through their interpretive frameworks that then inform the actual evidence basis. And so how do we expand that? How do we consider the ways in which that we can consider, other sources of knowledge within our work, whether that's gray literature, whether that's audiovisual, whatever the mechanism that Indigenous peoples deem relevant. And then just finally, and sorry for taking so long, but I'll then go to you, Asang. What are the parallel pathways, right? Like the last point that Ritodi raised, like, what are those parallel outputs? And so I think there's that parallel output within the IPCC generally. And for me, it's like, how are we not trying to force Indigenous knowledge into a non-Indigenous process, but we're creating those parallel tracks that enable the ethical conversation between knowledge systems. But also, how are we envisioning an assessment process that is grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing and being, which may not be the IPCC, right? Like maybe there are concerns about just the institutional legacies, and maybe we need to consider what does that parallel path for Indigenous peoples look like? And in a Canadian context, we started that journey through the For Our Future report, which was a standalone report that we produced as part of the Canadian climate assessment. Not quite an Indigenous exclusively process, but it's how do we start to get to that, to envision, what are the foundations and how do we communicate that in an effective way? So I'll stop there and go to you, Piston.
Thank you, Graham. I just want to acknowledge that I'm in my classroom and I have two of my students listening here. So I'll just make two quick comments. First is I just agree everything that Graham just said, and I want to echo that. And I want to point out that a lot of these mechanisms that need to be employed or need to be used by the IPCC that are being raised here today are not necessarily something the IPCC has to create on its own or innovate or produce or generate, right? So these are, there's a rich Indigenous body of literature and many, many Indigenous scholars who have worked on this for so many decades and have already found ways to do exactly that. So it's then the question of how does the IPCC create space and provide support and welcome these kinds of different Indigenous scholars who have already done the work into these spaces to inform. And then how can the IPCC learn from them? Instead of teaching and showing them what to do, it's like, how do you step back and listen and learn from the Indigenous scholarship that already exists? The second point I want to emphasize is this global North, global South distinction. And I think sometimes, and coming from a global South context myself, it's very important. I recognize that it's very important to talk about very specific global South context and histories and Indigenous peoples and experiences there. But what my data has shown from looking at the IPCC AR6 is that sometimes the most helpful, most meaningful and useful pieces of information for Indigenous peoples are actually coming from global North Indigenous scholars. And so what I really want to point out is that in terms of increasing participation or for inclusivity purposes, it would be really detrimental to Indigenous peoples everywhere if we divided Indigenous peoples according to the colonial boundaries and talk about global South and global North in that sense. This is not to say that we discourage inclusion of Indigenous scholars from the global South or provide resources and support to scholars from global South context, but really when we make those judgments and those criteria, I think it's very important to recognize that Indigenous peoples are speaking, despite the very specific histories and heterogeneities, they are speaking from a common place, and that common place needs to be recognized. And using the colonial borders and boundaries to separate Indigenous scholars from global South and global North might not be the best way to go about it, and might not be the best best for Indigenous peoples and their what they're trying to do. So with those two comments, I'll stop.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think that's been really helpful to hear about both some opportunities and things we can do to change, but also some challenges that we'll have to grapple with as we look ahead to AR7. Now we're going to shift to the next step in our session. We hope that some of you might be interested in engaging in the AR7 process. And so I wanted to walk you through some of the ways that you can engage in the process. So this is more of the pragmatic, logistical pieces of information. So I have a few slides that I'll share with you here. Oops. Okay, so you'll remember this slide from my first set of slides about the different ways to get involved. So again, contributing to the existing, like to the literature. So that's both gray literature and peer-reviewed literature that's citable in the reports. The second way is an expert reviewer. So that's to provide review comments on the 2 drafts that get circulated before it goes up for final government review. And then to be an author. And so that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my presentation is how you can apply to be an IPCC author. And we do need a lot of people to come together for these reports. So just as an example, some more numbers on the 6th assessment report. In the 6th assessment reports, across the reports, there were 796 authors. There were over 100,000 pieces of literature that were cited, and there were over 300,000 peer review comments. So this is a pretty massive undertaking, and we need lots of people, especially more Indigenous scholars and Indigenous knowledge holders in this process for the 7th assessment cycle. So this is sort of the jargon that comes with it. Right now, the calls for authors are open for coordinating lead author, and review editor. So those are the 3 different categories that are listed on the left side of the screen. So right now, the call for applications is open for these positions. But if you miss the deadline or you're not able to engage in that more fulsome, time-intensive way, there's other ways you can contribute too. So for example, being a contributing author. And the presenters and panelists had spoken to their experiences, some of them, on being a contributing author. So basically, the coordinating lead authors and lead authors invite different people from around the world to be contributing authors on the chapters. So contributing author is a way to contribute and to write text and to be part of the assessment, but you don't go through an application process. There's also opportunities to be chapter scientists as well as expert reviewers. So to be an IPCC author, there are some, I guess, challenges, and some of these have actually already been shared today. So the first is that IPCC authors, it's on a voluntary basis. There's no salary or reimbursement for your time to participate as an author. So all the authors, it's a volunteer role. In most cases, for example, when I was a lead author in the 6th assessment report, my university was supportive of me spending my university time, paid time, on the IPCC report. There are 4 in-person meetings over the course of a few years that lead authors and coordinating lead authors are required to go to. In terms of covering the travel costs of those meetings, if you are an author in the Global South, the IPCC has a trust fund to cover those travel expenses. If you are an author in the Global North, usually it's your country's government who pays for your participation, for your travel to these lead author meetings. So some timelines. The call for nominations opened on March 7th. And the deadline to apply is April 17th. But within some countries, there are internal deadlines before the 17th. So pay attention to your country's internal deadlines. You can find your country's focal point on the IPCC website. You can also look over the list of observer organizations and reach out to an observer organization to nominate you, or you can approach a bureau member to nominate you. Links to the application, where you can download the application form, where you can find your focal point, where you can find the list of observer organizations. We'll put that information in the chat so you have that at your fingertips. And if you are an Indigenous person or an Indigenous knowledge holder, please feel free to reach out to me if you would like me to nominate you as a bureau member. So if you'd rather not have your country nominate you for whatever reason, if you are an Indigenous person, I'm happy to nominate you. So the steps, first you reach out to the nominator, either a bureau member, an observer organization, or your country's focal point. You put together your application, and then your application gets submitted. And then it's reviewed by the IPCC Bureau, where authors are selected, considering range of expertise, gender, regional balance, among other considerations. In the link in the chat, you'll be able to find this page where you can look up your country's focal point contact information, where you can contact them. But just again, emphasizing it doesn't have to be through your country's focal point. It could also be through an IPCC observer organization or a bureau member. An important tip, if you are an Indigenous person and or an Indigenous knowledge holder, please clearly state this in your application. There are two parts to the application. There's an Excel form that you fill out and you attach a short CV. It's most helpful if you indicate that on both the Excel file and on your CV. Sometimes after, for the city's report, as a bureau member going through the applications, sometimes it was really hard to tell whether they were a non-Indigenous scholar engaging in Indigenous knowledge spaces, or whether they were actually an Indigenous knowledge holder themselves. And of course, based on the presentations that we heard from the past speakers, this positionality is really important. So making that clear is very, very helpful in the review and selection process. So we'll put all these links in the chat so that they're at your fingertips. And now we're going to move on to the next part of our session today. Okay, so now I'd like to invite all of the panelists and speakers to come back into the main webinar room, because now we're going to turn it over to all of you, to all of the participants in the audience. We really want to hear your comments and questions. And we want to encourage you to pop them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are an Indigenous person yourself and are comfortable noting that in your comment or question, we're going to try and prioritize your comments and questions first. So if all of the panelists and speakers could come back into the... Welcome back, everyone. Good to see you. Thank you so much for your presentations so far. All right, so we have lots of questions popping in, some of which have been answered. How about the first question we touch on is the wording of integration. So Rosa, you had commented on this in your presentation, that this was a word that was used in the sixth assessment cycle. So what's your take on well, I was gonna say the pros and cons of that word, but maybe it's only the cons.
Well, Ritodi answered also this question when his presentation, but I agree that integration is not the best word, because usually it implies that other knowledge systems are bringing only to validate what science is already saying, or in the case of policy also, integration is used when other knowledge systems, as Indigenous knowledge systems, are validated only because they agree with the agenda that is proposed. So that is the problem mainly, we believe, with the term of integration, that it implies a hierarchization of knowledge systems. And that is because, well, in our article and in different places, I know that better words are proposed, like partnerships, also engagement, some words that implies a more horizontal and equitable approach, as Ritodi says.
Awesome. Thank you so much to both of you for responding to that question that was in the Q&A chat. There's another chat question about do the various author roles, for example, review editors, reviewers, are they named as authored or acknowledged elsewhere? So if you are a coordinating lead author, a lead author, or a contributing author, you're acknowledged on the first page. Your name is presented on the first page of that chapter. If you contribute as an expert reviewer, so you participate in one of the 2 open peer review processes, your name and all of your comments are publicly available. So you are named in the report as well. And in a separate place, all of the comments are provided, as well as all of the authors' responses to your comments are provided. So yes, contributions are acknowledged. All right, let's see what else we have here. Okay. Okay, this one, I'll open it to any of the panelists or presenters to respond to. The question, given that it is inherently a political process more than a scientific one, in addition to creating space, is there scope to undertake a workshop with our authors on what can be, disciplinary biases, questions about subconscious bias, and what it means to co-design, co-produce as they draft, keeping these different power differentials in mind. Same with the government reviewers of the executive summary. Are the government's reviewers diplomats from foreign ministry or lines of ministry? Could we do that for them as well? Panelists, what are your thoughts on those ideas?
I can maybe talk to the first question. So I had raised a similar worry during my time as a contributing author on the mountains chapter, and about, hey, there are all of these biases that are entering. Specifically, I was quite worried about this, these causal links that were being drawn to between so-called natural disasters and climate extremes and climate events. So, one of the responses that I heard was that there's just no way of getting everybody up to speed, because what you're talking about is understanding this whole politics of knowledge production. And there's also this worry that there just isn't enough time to create process that'll allow us to avoid such a final predicament, right? At that point, one of the things that I had suggested was that, again, this sort of goes back to staffing or resourcing, is that each chapter should actually have a knowledge justice person on it. And instead of every author in that chapter being brought up to speed about everything, the role of this person can actually be to ensure exactly that these kinds of things don't happen. And the truth is that it's possible to do this. And I did it as part of my postdoc down here in Lincoln, where I kind of looked at the way power was circulating within like within a situation like this, right? Within a project like this. So I think, yes, while having a workshop with the authors can be useful to help people understand that such things exist, I'm not very sure that that actually would address the issues per se. So that's what I'll say.
Maybe I can add a comment from the role of observer organizations. So at the last IPCC 62 meeting in Hangzhou, China, which the Inuit Circumpolar Council was present in and delivered interventions both in written comment and to the floor, there was the discussion of on engaging diverse knowledge systems, which I believe both Sherry and Rosa were a part of drafting the proposal for, with the intention that it would create a possibility to potentially have some of these conversations to begin a dialogue within the IPCC process. And then we would wish for that process to develop into a longer term mechanism, like an advisory body, like a task force, like an Indigenous caucus, recognizing that a one-off workshop is too limited a conversation over 3 days with some 50 people to guide a process that's as institutionally ingrained as the IPCC. And additionally, within the structure of the negotiations, which have either acceptance or approval of outlines or text, this is both a a scientifically informed process, but also a politically embedded process. So some of the representatives in those meetings are from ministries of environment. Some of them, they're technical scientists, that's their training. And others are from ministries of foreign affairs. They're state representatives and they have state agendas that they bring to the room. And so the IPCC is an inherently political forum. We understand that these IPCC documents are intended to inform political mechanisms established under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that are informing the way that a treaty is implemented. So it's based within this very embedded nation state process. And so for land holders, for sovereign peoples, what is the participation with the occupying state affects the ability, the reflection of the participation of Indigenous peoples, the reaffirming of Indigenous, and thus the engagement with Indigenous knowledge within that space.
Thanks, Kata. Graham, over to you.
Yeah, sorry. I really love both of those responses, and it makes me just think of a very simple mantra about nothing about us without us. And to like Ritodi's point, guidance can only get you so far. What we're really talking about is direct participation of Indigenous peoples within, coordinating lead authors, and contributing lead authors. Just a couple of comments that just came out from this. Sometimes I feel like we're talking about like just 3 layers of work. The first layer is really like, how is research conducted itself, right? Like, how are we building the evidence basis that the IPCC will select from? And basically the IPCC has a cutoff date based on, whatever the reports are identified, where literature remains permissible, I guess is the language. And so, to everybody's point on the call, there's a lot of literature out there, and there can be a lot more that is generating this evidence basis. The second broad stage is like, how was that evidence being considered? And the unfortunate reality is that the majority of it is done through a disciplinary lens that is led by the contributing lead authors or the lead authors. And so to Ritodi's point about integration, like in the literature that I work with, that's been picked apart 20 years ago, right? Like there is like long bodies of literature that criticizes integration that for many hard physical and natural sciences isn't even close to being considered because it's not within their specific discipline. And so the second point there is like, how are we ensuring that those author teams are willing to engage with all these other sources of evidence and data and literature that frankly, like, it's embarrassing that we don't cite it within these spaces, and we only don't cite it because there's this like desire to uphold this knowledge hierarchy and disciplinary hierarchy that Rosa raised. And so the consideration of what evidence is valid is super important. And then we're talking about like how it's actually written, considered, and framed within the overall. And so we're saying like Indigenous peoples need to be at all of those interfaces, but that we need to differentiate these different pieces because each of those introduce bias into the system, and each of those uphold some of these like broader challenges within the IPCC generally about the way in which it reinforces certain ways of thinking, being, and doing. And that speaks also just to like which disciplines are incorporated, right? Like there's an overwhelming emphasis on hard physical and natural sciences. Policy, political science, ecologists, all of these other disciplines aren't really incorporated. And that's part of why it feels, that basically working group 1 is quite regressive compared to, more progressive bodies of literature. I think just like a broad point that Kata raised about this being a political space, like I do think part of the challenge is that we don't talk about it as a political space, and we talk about it as like a heavily technocratic, science-driven process when it's not. And like, yes, we can say that we are, advancing the interests of and the expertise of scientists, but at every stage, there is politics interwoven in it. The chapter outlines are agreed by governments. The author teams are selected and encouraged by governments. They're chosen by the Bureau based on factors that we don't actually know. Like there is no matrix of selection that is communicated. And so for all of these reasons, like, and I think part of it is just acknowledging that is the starting point, right? Like acknowledging that is how we then create all of these other spaces and create all of the other elements and opportunities for Indigenous peoples to contribute in a meaningful way. And Katarina, for instance, in the chat asked about like what's the realistic likelihood of a knowledge holder themselves to be selected. And the challenging part is like we don't know, right? Like we don't know what the likelihood of anybody to be selected is because, there are hundreds of thousands of people who want to be involved. And so again, what are the ways in which we create these alternative spaces? What are the ways in which, we create and continue to create that evidence that enables that institutional change? And I think it was Sushil's comments about like just like how can we envision and it looks like somebody in the chat, and sorry Sylvia, but like there are ways to manipulate the system. It's just we need to think about how to do it. And one of those is participating as an author, but all these other opportunities too. Sorry for taking a long time.
No, that was great, Graham. And I agree with your response to the question about Indigenous knowledge holders being selected. Some things to increase the likelihood of being selected. One is that if you are an Indigenous knowledge holder, make that very clear on your application. I do find it's hard to tell, and I often am trying to like Google people to see to find that information. So please do like clearly indicate that. The other thing is to look at the annotated, like the bulleted approved outlines, because the different expertise areas, we have to fill all of those in each of the chapters. So if you can sort of like point to which bullet, which like topic area in that chapter, like you'd be able to cover, or maybe you can cover all of them, or because, Indigenous knowledge systems are very integrative. Just to comment on that and make that clear. But points well taken, Graham, on that. So I'm going to pose one more question to the panel, and then maybe we'll wrap up. So I'm going to go to Michelle's question because I think it's a good one. So would IPCC consider enabling nominations to come directly from Indigenous governing bodies? Such as different tribal councils, Indigenous representative organizations, especially where they hold treaty-based sovereign status. This would support UN DRIP and ensure participation reflects Indigenous governance, not just state validation. So I'll start by saying that any change in IPCC policy has to be approved by consensus by the 195 member states. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the panelists just to reflect on that question, because I think that this gets at some deeper challenges that might be worth reflecting on here.
I can take this. Yeah, like Charlie shared, like there are so many institutional mechanisms that are going to be very hard to change. And in this seventh cycle, and we're having this discussion about all of the things we would like to see changed or different in the IPCC process. But I think there are going to be a lot of things that will not happen. And as far as from the IPCC perspective, I hope Ramon and Sherry can add more. But to answer that question directly, I don't think it's happening or it's going to happen, but I don't know 100%. But that being said, I also wanted to kind of point out like kind of add on to what Graham said earlier about the criteria of selection, the selection criteria. and whose knowledge gets counted. And it is very unclear. So just to for those in the audience, just to give a perspective on this, even Ritodi and I were nominated for the I believe the workshop, the outline drafting workshop, and we both got rejected. And so it's very unclear to us how that process works. And so that is, again, pointing out to the fact that there are so many Indigenous authors that we know are qualified, but will the institutional mechanism of the IPCC allow them to take part in this process, and what those criteria will be? I think those are very important questions to be thinking about. And also keeping in mind that a lot of this exclusive practices will continue even into this seventh cycle and will not be, so that's what I wanted to point out. And the pool of Indigenous authors, again, coming back to the point of, like, first of all, the pool of Indigenous scholars is not big if we are taking the criteria that we know IPCC employs into consideration, which is you have to have published, you have to speak in English, or you have to communicate in English, and you have to have a university degree, and all of these different requirements that are in place that we know from previous cycles that count towards somebody being selected as an author or a reviewer. So the pool is already small. And then on top of that, the fact that there is no resource allocated or provided or at least guaranteed for a lot of Indigenous authors or reviewers mean that it's hard for us, even from the Indigenous community, to encourage our fellow colleagues to nominate themselves, because we know it's going to be detrimental to their academic career. If they are in academia, or if they are knowledge holders, we're not sure how they will be compensated or how their data and their information are going to be protected and used in responsible and meaningful ways. So I just want to say those out loud and pass it on to Ramon.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just note that we have some questions that haven't been answered yet. We're going to note all of the questions and answer them after the session in a Q&A document that will circulate to everyone. So if we didn't get to your question, apologies, but we will be responding to all those questions after the session. I'll turn over to Ramon, and then I'll maybe invite an Indigenous panelist to close us out if somebody be willing to volunteer for that. Ramon.
Thank you very much, Shirley. Well, first of all, I would like to thank all of the speakers and also all the participants. For me, has been extremely interesting, the event. I must say that I have learned a lot as part of these two sessions dealing with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples. And I would like to convey some message. Firstly, is that the current leadership of the IPCC is committed to increase the inclusiveness of the process, to increase the participation, increase and improve the participation of the different knowledge systems, and also the interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, and in that sense, much more engagement and partnership with Indigenous people would be, in my view, I would expect that could be a result of this cycle, hopefully, and we are working in that direction. And I would like also to say that at the moment, I must recognize that all mechanisms to ensure full equity in this engagement of Indigenous people are not probably in practice, but we need to increase gradually this process. There are limitations, of course, in having an expert meeting, and there are limits for the workshop, but why not to use as much as possible this space to increase and improve the engagement and participation of Indigenous peoples in the whole process of the IPCC. Also, I have seen here some recommendations that are extremely useful in terms of how to increase the participation, the engagement with the three working groups, but particularly with working group 1, which where the lack of this presence of indigenous knowledge is much more recognized, but also for other working group 3, and how to keep the record of working group 2 in this regard, although this is not fully accomplished yet, this engagement even in working group 2. The role of lead author, I would say, is crucial. Having more lead authors, contributing author is not the only way, it's not the best way of really improving participation and engagement of indigenous people. And for sure, having more lead author is crucial in that sense. Observer organization of the IPCC, including those representing indigenous people, can nominate as part of the process. So I would say it's extremely important to increase the registration of indigenous observer organization representing indigenous people in this process. And this recommendation of going beyond the IPCC, also in terms of, at the moment, there are many exercises reproducing or trying to complement, I would say, working in parallel, as has been already said, with a national assessment report, and even, why not, an indigenous people report, trying to complement and trying also to capture all this wealth and richness of this knowledge that could be a basis for assessment, and also for sure filling the gaps in the IPCC process, that even considering this commitment that I mentioned at the very beginning, for sure would take some time to for us to be fully satisfied with the expected results in that direction. Of course, there are many things to do, and Shirley has called the attention in trying to visualize as much as possible those which are indigenous knowledge holders and experts to properly in the nomination process and so on. But and we are working in that direction. But for sure, there is a lot of things to do as part of the whole process, as part of the whole assessment process, and for sure also the Bureau has a role to play in this whole process. So thank you again for the invitation. Thank you for this possibility, and I'm also ready to work with Shirley and other colleagues in the Bureau to try to improve and increase the participation, the representation of the indigenous people in this process as in an equitable way, because I'm really committed with that. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vice Chair Ramon. Really appreciate your comments. Pasang, I'd love to turn the floor over to you for some final comments or advice or calls to action as we move forward in the 7th assessment cycle.
First of all, Tashtale, and I want to thank Ramon from the IPCC for your remarks and also opening this space and being so receptive and open to this conversation. But and I also want to recognize Sherry. You're doing the hard job of bringing all of us together and moderating this 2-day sessions. But now I want to thank ICC and AFN for your leadership in all of this and making this possible. And it's through Indigenous leadership again and again every year over the decades that have brought us to this point today. And the fact that we're having this conversation and being able to share our resources and our knowledge and expertise and insights with each other for the upcoming IPCC AR7 and thinking about the larger issue of how do we ethically and equitably engage with Indigenous knowledge and having this conversation. I really want to acknowledge and thank every one of you. And in the backstage, Amira and I see new names that I didn't see before yesterday, but I want to recognize all of the people in the background. And so the work that Rithodi and I did alongside our colleague, Kristen, from the UN Foundation, this was actually not supported by any funds. These were voluntary work that we did over the years. And so this is just to show that we are all determined to make the next version of AR7 as equitable and meaningful as possible. And it may not, And it will most likely not be the kind of Indigenous document that we would like to see, but knowing that we have all done our part to make it slightly more meaningful is a good thing, I think. And with that, I want to close the session, and back to you, Sherry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for that. And enjoy the rest of your day, your evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. And I hope that you'll consider joining us on this journey in AR7.
Thanks, everyone.